You are sealed inside a steel ball the size of a walk-in closet. Nearly 7 miles of black ocean press down on you. The temperature outside is just above freezing. The pressure is 8 tons on every square inch. And then, through a single cracked window, in the beam of one small light, something moves. A fish. That is what Jacques Piccard swore he saw at the very bottom of the Mariana Trench in 1960. A flatfish, he said, about a foot long, lying on the deepest floor on Earth. The problem is simple. According to everything modern science understands about life and pressure, that fish should not have been able to exist. It is biologically impossible. And that single impossible sighting is the thread I started pulling almost 20 years ago, the one that dragged me into a case I still cannot close. Because there is a real number, a hard physiological limit measured in a laboratory, that says vertebrate life cannot survive below roughly 8,200 meters. Piccard claimed he saw his fish at nearly 11,000. If you stay with me to the end, I will show you the exact expedition, the exact year, and the exact chemical data that finally revealed what is really living down there, and it is stranger and more disturbing than a single fish ever was. This is not a legend. Every piece of it is written into published records I will name as we go. I still remember where I was when this first got its hooks into me. I was in a cold university library annex, late, the kind of quiet where you can hear the fluorescent lights buzz, and I pulled a battered book off a shelf almost by accident. It fell open to Piccard's own account of the descent. I read the line about the flatfish 3 times, and I felt this small, cold drop in my stomach, because I already knew enough to know it shouldn't be true. I put the book down, and I did not sleep that night. I have been chasing the bottom of that trench ever since. Let me take you down the way I went down. Slowly, one clue at a time. The first thing I had to understand was the machine itself, because the story starts with a vessel that had no business surviving the journey. It was called the Trieste, a bathyscaphe designed by Jacques Piccard's own father, Auguste. Picture a fat float filled with gasoline, because gasoline is lighter than water and does not compress, and slung beneath it a tiny spherical cabin of forged steel with walls about 5 inches thick. 2 men climbed inside on the 23rd of January 1960. Jacques Piccard, the Swiss engineer, and Don Walsh, a United States Navy lieutenant. Their target was the deepest known point in the ocean, a slot in the western Pacific called the Challenger Deep. The descent took nearly 5 hours. Think about that. 5 hours of falling in the dark, watching the depth gauge climb into numbers no human eyes had ever occupied. They passed 1,000 meters, 2,000. The light from the surface vanished completely somewhere around the first few hundred, and after that there was nothing but the cone of their own lamp and the endless drift of pale marine snow falling past the window. Then, at roughly 9,000 meters down, the whole cabin shook with a violent crack. Both men froze. Walsh later described it as a muffled explosion, and for a terrible moment neither of them knew if the sphere had begun to fail. It had not. What had cracked was one of the outer window panes, a layer of plexiglass in the entry tube, not the pressure hull itself. But at that depth, with that much ocean stacked overhead, a single unexpected sound is the sound of your own death arriving early. They made a decision that tells you everything about these 2 men. They kept going down. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon they touched bottom. The depth they logged was 35,814 feet, which is about 10,916 meters. Later, more careful surveys corrected the true depth to just under 11,000 meters. But the point stands. 2 human beings were now sitting on the floor of the deepest hole on the planet, in a place where the pressure is more than 1,000 times what you feel right now. Roughly 16,000 pounds on every square inch of steel around them. And here is where the mystery begins, because of what Piccard said he saw in that first moment. As the Trieste settled, he looked through the cracked window into the beam of the light, and he reported a fish. Not a shrimp, not a worm, a vertebrate. In his own words, it resembled a sole, a kind of flatfish, roughly 1 foot long and about 6 inches across, and he said it moved away slowly across the ooze. He was so certain of it that he wrote it up as proof, hard proof, that higher forms of life could survive at the greatest depth in the ocean. They stayed on the bottom for only about 20 minutes. Their landing had kicked up a soft cloud of pale sediment that hung in the water and ruined much of the visibility, and the cracked window made everyone nervous. Then they dropped their iron ballast and began the long climb back toward the sun. When they surfaced, the story flashed around the world. Man had reached the bottom, and man had seen life there. A fish, waiting in the dark. For decades, that was the accepted story. A flatfish at the bottom of the world. But the deeper I read, the more that fish refused to sit still in my mind. Because the more marine biologists learned about pressure and living tissue, the more impossible Piccard's sighting became. That is the thread that pulled me under. So I went looking for the reason a fish should not be able to live down there, and what I found was not vague hand-waving, it was chemistry, measured and specific, and it changed how I understood the entire ocean. Here is the thing almost no one tells you about the deep sea. The enemy is not just the crushing force. The enemy is what that force does to the molecules inside a living cell. Every one of your proteins is a delicate folded shape, and the way it folds is what lets it work. Squeeze it hard enough, and the pressure literally deforms those shapes. Proteins stop folding correctly. Enzymes stop functioning. The machinery of the cell begins to seize up. For most of the animals we know, that failure starts to bite somewhere in the deep ocean, long before you ever reach the trench floor. But deep-sea creatures have a trick. Their cells are loaded with a small molecule, a chemical called trimethylamine N-oxide. Scientists shorten it to TMAO. You have actually smelled it. That distinctive fishy odor of ocean fish is largely this compound. What it does is act like a molecular brace. It stabilizes proteins and helps them keep their proper shape under pressure, counteracting the squeezing force. And here is the beautiful, damning part. Researchers found that the deeper a fish lives, the more TMAO its body contains. It scales almost perfectly with depth. The pressure goes up, the amount of this protective molecule goes up right alongside it, in a straight line. The man whose work anchored all of this for me is a physiologist named Paul Yancey, who has spent his career studying these osmolytes in deep-sea animals. And when he and his colleagues plotted that straight line out, they realized it does not go on forever. It hits a wall. Because TMAO is not free. It changes the chemistry of the fish's cells. Pack in enough of it to survive extreme depth, and eventually the inside of the fish becomes more concentrated than seawater itself. When that happens, water would start rushing into the fish's body uncontrollably by simple osmosis. The very molecule keeping it alive would begin to kill it. When they calculated where that wall sits, the number they arrived at was astonishing in its precision. Somewhere around 8,200 meters, give or take a couple hundred, is the deepest a fish can physically exist. Below that line, a vertebrate cannot hold itself together. Not because it would be uncomfortable, because the chemistry simply forbids it. I sat with that number for a long time, 8,200 meters, and Piccard's flatfish was reported at nearly 11,000. That is not a small overshoot. That is almost 3 kilometers, nearly 2 miles, below the theoretical floor of vertebrate life. If Yancey's chemistry is right, then Piccard could not have seen a fish. It is not a matter of rarity or luck. It is a matter of physics saying no. So now I had a genuine contradiction, the kind that keeps you up. On one side, a decorated engineer and a Navy officer, eyewitnesses at the deepest point on Earth, insisting they saw a vertebrate. On the other side, hard laboratory chemistry insisting that vertebrate cannot be there. One of them had to be wrong. And that is the moment the explanation everyone gave me stopped sitting right. The official story keeps closing cases the evidence never really closed. That is why I gathered these records into books. They lay out what the data shows, not the tidy version. Tonight, read Piccard's account beside Yancey's chemistry. The books are First Threshold, Deep Signal, and Hidden Systems. The fastest way to get the books is to scan the QR code right there on your screen, or go to the link in the description, or the pinned comment. Now, back to the objection I know you are already making. Now, I know exactly what you are thinking, because I thought it too, and I thought it hard. You are thinking the answer is obvious. Piccard was tired, the window was cracked. The cabin had just been rattled by a bang that nearly stopped his heart. The bottom was a fog of stirred-up silt. He had been falling through darkness for 5 hours with his nerves stretched to the breaking point. A man in that state, staring into a swirling cloud lit by one lamp, sees a shape, and his brain fills in a familiar animal. He did not see a fish. He saw a sea cucumber, or a sediment ripple, or nothing at all, and he wanted it to be a fish so badly that it became one. I want to be honest with you. For years, that was the explanation I accepted. It is clean. It is rational. It respects the chemistry. And it does not require calling 2 respected men liars, only human. Even Don Walsh himself, in later years, was far more cautious than Piccard about what they had actually seen down there. And many marine biologists quietly concluded that the famous flatfish was most likely a sea cucumber, a holothurian, which is a soft, bottom-crawling animal that genuinely does live at those depths, and can, in a murky glimpse, look vaguely like a flat, pale, gliding shape. Case closed. I moved on. Except it would not stay closed. Because the harder I looked at that tidy explanation, the more I noticed what it quietly skipped over. It assumed the chemistry limit was a perfect, universal wall. And that assumption is exactly the thing that started to crack when scientists finally went back down there with cameras, decades after the Trieste. What they filmed did not confirm the fish, but it did something almost more unsettling. It proved that the deepest floor of the ocean is not the dead, empty place the boring explanation quietly assumes. It is crawling with life that has no right to be so tough. And once I saw that, I could no longer be comfortable dismissing anything about the bottom of the trench. That is the point where my own doubt broke. So let me show you exactly what broke it. In 2012, more than 50 years after the Trieste, the filmmaker and explorer James Cameron built his own vertical torpedo of a submersible, the Deep Sea Challenger, and made the first solo dive to the bottom of the Challenger deep. He carried high-definition cameras. He was looking, among other things, for exactly the kind of life Piccard described. And on the deepest floor, he did not find fish. What he found were amphipods, small pale crustaceans that look like overgrown fleas, some of them unusually large, skittering across the sediment. He described the very bottom as an alien, lunar place. No soul, no flatfish. The vertebrate simply was not there, right where the chemistry says it should not be. So the fish itself stayed unconfirmed. But now watch what happened when other scientists started answering a different question. Not what did Piccard see, but where exactly does vertebrate life actually stop? For a long time, that 8,200-meter line was a prediction, a calculation on paper. Nobody had ever filmed the true limit. So teams began hunting for the deepest fish on Earth, dropping baited camera landers into trench after trench, watching the numbers climb. They found a creature that became the center of my obsession all over again, the snailfish. If you have never seen one, forget everything the words deep sea monster put in your head. A snailfish looks almost heartbreakingly gentle. It is small, often pale pink or ghost white or translucent, with soft, loose, gelatinous flesh and a body that looks like it is half melting, like a tadpole made of wet tissue paper. There is no armor, no fangs, no glowing lure. It is the most fragile-looking thing imaginable. And it turns out that fragility is the secret. That soft, watery, gel-like body is precisely what lets it survive pressure that would crush a stronger-looking animal, because it has almost no air spaces and almost nothing rigid to deform. A whole species was discovered living in the Mariana Trench itself, later named the Mariana snailfish, filmed thriving around 8,000 meters down, feeding on those swarms of amphipods, ruling a kingdom no other fish could enter. And when researchers tested its tissues, the TMAO levels were sky-high, right up near the ceiling that Yancey's chemistry predicted. The snailfish was not breaking the rule. It was living directly on top of the rule, pressed flat against the theoretical wall, as far down as a vertebrate can possibly go. That was the moment the whole picture flipped for me. The chemistry was not some abstract theory that made Piccard's story impossible and left it there. It was a real, physical boundary, and there was a real animal living right at the edge of it. The limit was true, which meant Piccard's fish, nearly 3 kilometers below that edge, really could not have been a fish. But it also meant something I had underestimated for years. Life does not fade away politely as you go deeper. It presses right up to the absolute physical maximum and thrives there, in numbers, in whole populations. The deep was not empty. It was full, right up to the line. And that raised the question that finally took me all the way to the bottom. If the deepest floor, below the fish line, is not dead, then what exactly is down there? What is living in the place where even the snailfish cannot follow? Because that answer, when I finally found it in the published data, is the thing that genuinely changed everything for me, and it has almost nothing to do with a flatfish. Let me set it up, because you need one more piece first. The very floor of the Challenger Deep, below the fish line, belongs to the amphipods and to things even stranger. In 2011, researchers from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography sent unmanned landers down and filmed giant single-celled organisms called xenophyophores living at around 10,600 meters. Read that again, single-celled, and yet some of these things grow to about 4 inches across, larger than your palm, built like delicate mineral sponges sitting on the ooze. They are among the largest individual cells known to exist anywhere, and they carpet parts of the deepest trench in numbers, filtering the sediment. The bottom of the world is not a barren plain. It is an ecosystem, an ancient one, running on the faint rain of dead material drifting down from miles above. So the deepest ocean is alive, densely, weirdly alive. That much I had finally accepted, and it was more than enough mystery to keep me digging. But the true payoff, the thing that reframed the entire story for me, and honestly haunts me more than any flatfish ever did, came from a study I did not expect. It did not ask what lives down there. It asked what is inside the things that live down there. And the answer is the reason I am telling you all of this. In 2017, a team led by a marine ecologist named Alan Jameson, working out of Newcastle University, published a study in the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. Jameson has become one of the great modern explorers of the trenches, the man who has put more cameras and sampling gear on the deepest floors of the planet than almost anyone alive. For this study, his team collected amphipods, those pale scavenging crustaceans, from the very bottom of two of the deepest trenches on Earth. One of them was the Mariana Trench, in the Pacific, near where Piccard sat in 1960. The other was the Kermadec Trench, thousands of miles away. Both of them among the most remote, untouched-seeming places that exist anywhere on our world. Places no sunlight has ever reached, that no human had touched for the entire history of our species until a few decades ago. Then they analyzed the tissue of those bottom-dwelling amphipods for man-made chemicals. Specifically for persistent organic pollutants, the industrial poisons like PCBs, the polychlorinated biphenyls once used in electrical equipment and coolants, and flame retardants, chemicals we manufactured on the surface in the 20th century. Chemicals that were banned decades ago precisely because they never break down and they poison everything they touch. And here is what they found. The results were not a trace. They were not a whisper of contamination. The amphipods at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, nearly 11 kilometers down, in the deepest, most isolated habitat on the face of the Earth, were saturated with our pollution. In some of the samples, the levels of these industrial chemicals were up to 50 times higher than in crabs living in one of the most polluted river systems in all of China, a river fed directly by heavy industry. 50 times. At the bottom of the world. I remember reading that number and going very still. Because think about what it actually means. The one place we imagined was beyond our reach. The sealed vault at the bottom of the ocean. The last untouched frontier. The place Piccard risked his life just to glimpse for 20 minutes. Is not untouched at all. Our chemistry got there before we ever did in any real numbers. The pollutants sank through 7 miles of water, settled into the sediment, were eaten by the amphipods, concentrated in their bodies, and now form a permanent part of the deepest food web on the planet. The snailfish that live at the limit of what chemistry allows eat those amphipods. They are eating our poison, filtered and concentrated, in a place we told ourselves we could never spoil. That is the footage, the data, that truly changed everything. Not a fish that might have been a sea cucumber. Something far heavier. We sent human beings to the very bottom to answer a simple, hopeful question. Is there life down there? And the ocean answered yes. And then, decades later when we finally looked closely, it answered a second question we never thought to ask. It told us that there is no longer anywhere on this planet that exists apart from us. The deepest trench on Earth carries our fingerprints in its bloodstream. And it forced me to look back at Piccard's flatfish with completely different eyes. Because whether or not that specific man saw that specific fish in that swirling silt in 1960, the instinct behind his story was right in a way he could never have known. Something is alive at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Populations of it. An entire ancient ecosystem, from giant single cells to soft ghostly fish pressed against the chemical ceiling of life. He was reaching for the truth that the deep is not dead. He just could not have imagined the darker truth waiting underneath it, that by the time we proved him half right, we had already changed the very bottom we were trying to understand. I went looking for a fish that could not exist. What I found instead was a mirror. The deepest, oldest, most alien place on our world, and staring back out of it, our own reflection, written in banned industrial chemicals inside a creature the size of your fingernail. Here is what I keep coming back to. Alone, late. The same feeling I had in that library 20 years ago. We spent a century imagining the bottom of the ocean as the ultimate elsewhere, the one door we had not walked through. And the truth is, there is no elsewhere anymore. That is the thing they discovered down there. Not a monster. Us. If you have made it this far, you are not the kind of person who accepts the tidy version. The one where the famous flatfish is explained away in a sentence and everyone moves on. You are the kind who wants to know what was actually on the floor of the trench, and what it means that we found ourselves already there. That is exactly who I make these for. So I want to hear from you. Do you believe Jacques Piccard really saw a living fish at nearly 11,000 meters in 1960, against everything the chemistry says, or do you think his mind filled the darkness with what he wanted to see? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where in the world you are watching from, because I read them, and the sharpest questions I have ever chased came from people just like you. If you have your own theory about that flatfish, I genuinely want to see it. And if this is the kind of case you cannot let go of either, the one science filed away and told us not to reopen, then come with me. This channel is a small group of people who keep pulling the threads everyone else cut. Because the next descent I am working on is a set of sounds recorded in the deep Pacific that no research vessel has ever fully explained. One of them loud enough to be picked up by sensors thousands of miles apart, and the official name they gave it only made the mystery worse. Stay with me. We are not done going down. Before you go, let me tell you where this goes next. For members, I keep going, all the way to the real expedition and chemical data, everything I couldn't fit here. Inside, you can ask me your own questions, and I answer you myself. No bots. And you won't be alone. You'll belong with fellow mystery lovers in the Unexplained Society. Just point your phone's camera at the code. Cancel anytime. One click, no risk. Now, if that stunned you, wait until you see the strange creature filmed even deeper down, the one making scientists rethink what can survive in the dark. It's starting right here.